And of course, we're moving to ECOWAS now, where the Economic Community of West African States has lifted some of the sanctions imposed on Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali after the military took over governance in the countries. The regional bloc announced this during its extraordinary session in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Of course, we had several of these presidents in attendance, and of course, the areas where the sanctions were lifted were majorly economic sanctions been lifted. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by the noted political scientist, Professor Jubrin Ibrahim, who is the chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you so much, Prof, for joining us. And of course, we're beginning to have questions, and the questions are, what's going on with ECOWAS? We thought that the sanctions were imposed to actually prevent military adventurers from taking advantage of their superior power within the state to actually capture the state. And now we hear that only economic sanctions are being removed and political sanctions are still being left. We thought that the economic sanctions were actually the ones making these people to want to talk at the first instance.
Well, I think what's happening is that a strategy was developed, it was deployed, it didn't work. And when they saw the evidence that it wasn't working, there was a review and a decision to adopt a different approach. And I think it's fine if organizations believe they've made a tactical or strategic blunder, decide to correct their ways and take a new route to get them to where they want to get to. So it's a really deep and profound review of their approach, and I hope it works.
And the question is, why would ECOWAS now ask them to come back to the discussion table, to the dialogue table, when these same countries, especially Niger, for example, was asking for dialogue, but of course it looks like ECOWAS was snubbing it? Wouldn't it look like these countries have actually won and they're at liberty whether to come back to the negotiation table or not?
You see, let's go back to the origin of the problem. There was a coup in Chad, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, and then in Niger. Now, this is a very disturbing set of developments because it looked as if all the democratic regimes that ECOWAS had worked so hard to set up over a 30-year period were crumbling, and it was a domino effect. So when Niger happened, there was an immediate review by ECOWAS, and they came to the conclusion that they needed to use extreme measures to stop similar coups happening in other countries. So the situation was ECOWAS countries were panicking that they were next in line for a coup and therefore were ready to take very strict action. So they imposed very strict sanctions against these countries. Even threatened within 1 week direct military action against Niger.
Yeah.
Now, the problem in international relations is that you don't issue a threat you are not ready to back up.
Yeah.
So they issued the threat, their bluff was called, and then it was incumbent upon them to now take the military action. And they found out they didn't have the capacity to, which these countries must have read, that they don't really have the capacity. So that was where the strategic blunder was made. And as soon as it became clear to these countries, as well as to the other ECOWAS members, that that maximum threat cannot be implemented, then everything fell flat. And these countries were emboldened and started laughing at ECOWAS, calling them big for nothing and all that. And this was all very destabilizing for ECOWAS. But the mistake had been made. A maximalist approach had been taken, it had failed. Threats had been issued that could not be backed up by action. So in that context, ECOWAS had to now, in spite of its pride, go back on its words and take a different approach. So that's where we are. It's a very profound review. ECOWAS, by these actions, is admitting they've made a tactical, but above all, a strategic blunder. ECOWAS does not want a situation where it starts losing its members. ECOWAS, as you recall, was made up of 16 countries. And over the almost 50-year period, we lost only one country, Mauritania.
Yeah, Mauritania.
Now losing 3 at a go is a serious threat. And that's 15% of the population of ECOWAS going off. And that would have profound effects on its future. So there was a decision, as I understand it, to rebuild strategy, to try to rebuild relations. But ECOWAS now will be doing it from a point of weakness rather than a point of strength. And that's the challenge for ECOWAS.
And of course, the alliance of Sahel states being formed by these 3 countries is what we also hear that has made ECOWAS to re-strategize, because, I mean, letting go of these 3 countries and then for these 3 countries forming a confederation, there's a tendency, for example, to also attract other French-speaking countries. And of course, the confederation could actually keep growing. So how much of a threat do you think that the alliance of Sahel states could potentially be for a regional bloc like ECOWAS?
Well, it's always a threat when you start losing your members, and to that extent it is a threat. But it's important to take on board that these 3 countries constitute just 10% of the GDP of ECOWAS. They are among the 3 poorest countries in the world. They are landlocked. Their population is dependent on migration to surrounding countries for survival purposes. The food they eat is basically produced in neighboring countries. So they also have a lot of vulnerabilities. This may be a moment in which they will think, yes, all the strength is on our side, but in a very fundamental sense, they are also very vulnerable. And I think the time has come for both sides to reflect seriously on where they are and to come to the conclusion that no side will gain by maintaining this departure, and that both have an interest to come together and work out a way in which cooperation could resume between them and political, social, and economic life will return to normalcy.
And Prof, I want you to clarify this for our listeners, viewers actually. When the ECOWAS actually says it has lifted some economic sanctions, what exactly do we expect to see next? What are those things that we'll see resuming and all of that? Some people already been happy. For example, with the Nigerian borders, people are saying that, look, there may be a free movement of goods and services between Nigeria and Niger, for example, but others are saying it may or may not be so. So what exactly are we looking out for?
Well, the first thing is that borders have been ordered to be open. ECOWAS has decided closure of border has ended. Secondly, ECOWAS has decided to remove financial sanctions, economic sanctions. Thirdly, overflight of territories, airspace have been lifted. Then ECOWAS has also, the same day you and I met, that's the Francophone group, on Saturday, and they've lifted the restrictions they have placed on access to currencies and to loans for these 3 countries. So I think essentially most of the sanctions have been lifted. And don't forget, there is another country with a military regime, which is Guinea. And Guinea has also benefited from lifting of sanctions, although it's not part of the 3 states in the Association of Sahelian States. So I think it's really a complete reprogramming of the history and policy of sanction implementation by ECOWAS, because the whole purpose of these sanctions has been to force them to the negotiating table, to make concessions and to make a quick return to a democratic and civil order. Now that has not worked. These are very tough military regimes that are determined to sustain themselves in power using military means, and ECOWAS has to re-strategize.
And one of the things that we actually see, for example, ECOWAS talking about Niger, is that they're asking that President Bazoum should still be released. That's one of their insistence from their communique, saying that, look, holding this president, they don't call him former president, president hostage, it's not something that we will continue to take. How feasible do you think that President Bazoum can be released, soonest?
Well, there have been two fundamental changes that occurred with the communique that came out on Sunday. The first thing is that ECOWAS was arguing Bazoum was still the president, and that therefore the representatives of his government would still attend ECOWAS meeting. The Saturday meeting, the Bazoum representatives were not invited to the meeting. Secondly, for the first time in its communique issued on Sunday, ECOWAS described Bazoum as the former president of Niger, which means they now accept that the coup is a reality, which the whole world has known for 6 months, but now ECOWAS is also aware of that fact. They've recognized it, and it has come into the implementation of its policy framework. So they are still requesting that he should be released, but not as president, but as a former president of the country.
And as we try to round off this conversation, there's been this discussion in which these three countries, have brought to the fore over time. And that is it, that ECOWAS is actually a Western puppet-driven organization. With all these economic sanctions being gradually withdrawn, is ECOWAS trying to re-strategize its image and make, people within the economic community know that, some decisions actually taken by leaders are not being Western-driven?
Well, in one of the things this conflict has brought up is the excessive use of propaganda, especially against ECOWAS. The characterization of ECOWAS as a puppet Western organ is completely without foundation. It is malicious, and it's a concoction. Democracy has been pursued by ECOWAS based on the declaration of political principles African heads of states took in 1981, and based on the supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance that ECOWAS leaders themselves wrote up in 2001. It's on the basis of these two documents that the democracy policy of ECOWAS has been pursued. There was no foreign involvement in the development of these instruments, and it is really irresponsible of these people to be characterizing ECOWAS as a puppet of Western governments. There's no foundation on it, it's malicious, and they should stop that propaganda.
Not even with the talks here and there that the French are actually penetrating ECOWAS and, using some funds to actually pursue some decision-making by the organ, especially the organ of the heads of state and government.
France is not a member of ECOWAS. It doesn't attend its meetings. It has no representatives in ECOWAS establishment. The fact of the matter is that some of the members of ECOWAS are pro-French, others are anti-French. And like all regional organizations, this organization plays its diplomacy and politics within the context of the contours of its own internal construction. So that's a reality. But from there, to characterize the organization itself as a puppet of France is very irresponsible and has no foundation.
And just before I let you go, what do you make of the turnout of events in Senegal? I mean, we've been seeing lots of developments, the Constitutional Court saying one thing, the Parliament saying the other, and then, of course, the President, Macky Sall, actually, working to ensure that he gets the elections postponed till December. But the Constitutional Court has ruled that it looks like there seems to be a crisis. Aren't we afraid that there could actually be, an intervention by the military in Senegal?
Well, I'm very much afraid that Senegal has deliberately provoked a major constitutional and political crisis for itself. There was no basis for the decision of Macky Sall to propose legislation to shift the elections, because the Senegalese constitution is clear. Elections are clear timelines that cannot be changed by an incumbent president. So when he started that, he knew he was engaging in the path of illegality. When he engaged on that path, the Supreme Court, or the Constitutional Court intervened and told him two things. That one, the dates of the elections are sacrosanct. Secondly, when your tenure finishes on 2nd April, you must leave power, because part of the package he prepared was for him to continue in power beyond his 2 terms. And the court told him very clearly, you must leave when your tenure leaves. They gave instructions that now, since the Constitution says the president fixes the date for elections, he should immediately set a date as soon as possible for the elections. Now he has refused to set a date. He's dilly-dallying, causing all sorts of delays, and saying that, well, he wants to have a discussion with political forces in the country. What discussion? You've caused a crisis. People are on the streets demonstrating. Right. There's a lot of anger in the land. This is not the time for discussion. This is the time for obeying the Constitution, obeying the courts, and acting out in a manner that preserves Senegalese democracy. But he's not doing that. He's pushing things to the limit, and we do hope Senegal will preserve its constitutional regime.
Well, and that's why several people are expecting ECOWAS to blow hot on these issues, and not only when there's a military push in that country, but we just hope that, things will go well, and Senegal doesn't lose its democracy. But we must thank you so much, Professor Jubrin Ibrahim of the Center for Democracy and Development. We must thank you so much for joining us to help us understand these issues happening within the west coast of Africa. Well, that's how it's been for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Do join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Goodbye, and thank you for watching. I'm Som Nasango.